everybody, welcome to part 2 of 3 of our eight, week 8 pre-lab about correlations. So in this portion of the pre-lab, we're going to look at assumptions of correlation. So this should be a little bit of a review from last week in our assumption testing. For correlations, the first assumption that we want to test is normality. So looking at whether the data follows a normally distributed bell curve. So for normality, we're going to create histograms, which are going to run before we do any type of correlation. And we're going to calculate or have SPSS calculate our skewness and kurtosis values, making sure that our values are between 2 and -2. We're also going to run linearity, so create a scatter plot of our two variables. And this will be run before as well. And here we're looking for that our variables are linearly related, that we have a straight non-horizontal line between our two variables. And finally, before we can start any correlation, we are going to want to test our assumption of outliers. So running our z-scores in SPSS and then determining if any data points are beyond plus or minus 3.29 standard deviations from the mean. For this pre-lab, I'm going to walk you through running our normality, outliers, and linearity with Chapter 5, Dataset 3, which is available to you in Carmen. So you can go ahead and watch me run through it and run through it yourself, or run through it with me at the same time. But from now on, I'm going to be working in SPSS. These slides are here to help you walk along outside of this video and complete your assumptions. I'm going to open up Chapter 5, Dataset 3. We've seen this dataset before. This is where we're looking at speed and strength, are our two variables. So we're trying to decide whether speed, a person's speed, and strength are related to each other, whether they have a correlation, if they're correlated. So before I can run my correlation, I am going to run my assumptions. To run normality, I'm going to go to Analyze, Descriptives, Explore. Since I am running I want to run a correlation on both speed and strength, I'm going to move both of these variables into my dependent list so that SPSS runs skewness and kurtosis as well as histograms for both of them. Once I move them over, I'll go into plots and make sure my histogram is checked off. I'll uncheck stem and leaf because I don't need that. I'll click continue, and then I'm going to click OK. And my output comes up, and it takes a little second. But for each of my variables, both speed and strength, I am going to get a descriptives box as well as histograms. So you'll note in here that I have one big descriptives box. The top portion is telling me about strength, and the bottom is telling me about speed. If I look over at skewness and kurtosis, these two values under statistic for strength, both of my values fall between -2 and 2 here. So for my variable strength, I can say so far that normality is upheld. If I scroll down and look at speed, the skewness and kurtosis values for speed, those values also fall between 2 and -2. And so I can say that my normality is upheld so far for those values. I'm going to also add my my bell curve line to each of my histograms. And it looks like from this histogram, even though we can see that there may be an outlier here, we have a relatively well-distributed bell curve, and that goes along with my skewness and kurtosis values for strength, even though we're kind of approaching 2 right here. We can say that our assumption for normality for the variable of strength is upheld. I don't need this box plot, don't worry about that. Next, I'm going to go down to the histogram for speed. I'm going to double click to activate that, add my bell curve, and I will go ahead and X out of the chart editor. So this histogram here, it might look a little platycurtic to me just from visually inspecting it. However, if I go up and look at my skewness and kurtosis values for speed, I don't have anything falling outside -2 and 2. So I can say that normality is upheld and the bell curve is relatively normal, maybe a little bit platycurtic, but my assumption is upheld. It's not too not normal for me to continue with running my correlation for those two variables. So that is normality for those variables. Make sure you're checking back into the slides from assumption testing week for formatting on how to do those write-ups. You will include in the correlation assignment both histograms, or all histograms that you need to, and all of these skewness and kurtosis descriptives for every variable that you're going to run. So if this was part of the assignment, I would include this chart and both of my histograms for normality. Going back into my data set, I'm now going to run linearity for both of my variables. To run linearity, I'm going to go to Graphs and Chart Builder. I'll scroll down to Scatter Dot and click on the Simple Scatter Plot. At this point, it does not matter to me which axis I put my speed and my strength on, because I'm not looking for whether one influences the other or not. I'm not looking for independent or dependent variables. All I'm going to be looking for is whether there is a straight non-horizontal line or a linear relationship that exists between my variables. So I'll put one of these on each axis and I'm going to hit OK. And my output window gives me a scatter plot of speed by strength. I'm going to go ahead and double click on my scatter plot and add my line of best fit. All right. And that is all I need to do to run linearity. But now I need to describe what I'm seeing. Is linearity upheld? Do I have a straight line? Yes, I do. Is it not horizontal? Yes, it is. Not horizontal. So I can therefore say that because I have a straight non-horizontal line for a relationship between speed and strength, that the assumption of linearity is upheld. And I would include this scatter plot and that write-up in the assignment for each variable. And if you notice, I don't have two scatter plots because I can run speed and strength in a scatter plot at the same time. So you would just say for each variable, for speed and strength, there existed a linear relationship. So then assumption of linearity is upheld for both variables. And finally, we're going to look at outliers for both variables. So to run outliers or calculate my z-scores for speed and strength, I'm going to go up to Analyze, Descriptives, and Descriptives, the same place I would go to if I was going to run mean and standard deviation by themselves. Click on Descriptives, and I'm going to move all of my scaled variables over that I'm going to use for my correlation later. And then check off the Save Standardized Values as Variables. I don't need to look in my output window, even though they do give me my descriptive statistics. I'm instead going to go back to my data set, into my variable view or data view, and look at my two z-scores. SPSS created two separate variables that show us z-scores for both speed and strength. What I'm going to want to do now is for each one, I'll sort ascending. So I'll have to look at one at a time. At the top end here, I have negative 1.24. That falls within my plus or minus 3.29 standard deviation from the mean, so that number that we're going to compare that to. So I don't see an outlier at this top end. I go down to the bottom, 1.607 also falls within plus or minus 3.29 standard deviations from the mean. So I can say there are no outliers within the z-scores for speed, and my assumption of outliers is thus upheld for speed. Let's go over to strength. I'll have to sort ascending or descending again. At the top end, I have no outlier up here. Nothing falls outside of plus or minus 3.29. And same for the bottom end here. Nothing falls outside of plus or minus 3.29. And so I can say the assumption of outliers is upheld for strength as well. For your output, since we don't look at an actual output for outliers, you will just screenshot either the whole thing, since this is a relatively small data set, or the first few lines of each z-score. So I'll get the first few lines of z-scores for speed, and the last couple lines, as well as the first couple lines for strength, and the last couple lines. And you will accompany that with a write-up describing whether the assumption of outliers was upheld or not, and tell me why. So if I go back into our PDF, I definitely walk you through, if you don't want to rewatch the whole video, I walk you through the steps in this video, and I show you where you're pulling your numbers from in case you forget as well. We look at the histograms in here, and then we also look at outliers. Okay, tune back into the final part of the correlations pre-lab, where I actually walk you through how to run a correlation in SPSS, and we talk a little bit about how to interpret that correlation.